Thank you for joining us for Effective Heart Change, the podcast that will discuss how to apply faith principles to real-life situations. This is Effective Heart Change. And now, your co-host, Matthew.
Thank you, folks, for joining us again today on Effective Heart Change, here with David Case. David, today we're going to be talking about something that's pretty current and pretty applicable. We're going to be talking about rebellion. What's your thoughts on rebellion and the current state of things?
Actually, if you want to take it all the way back, some people would say that's how our country was founded. So you actually get the mix of things, and you get part of why it is so interesting, because at what point, and we're actually doing a look back right now and trying to reevaluate our history, and many people are looking back at the founders and saying, hey, they had slaves, so therefore they're evil or whatever. Well, from an American standpoint, the Declaration of Independence was a good thing, and it was seeking out freedom of religion, etc. So when is rebellion, and when do we fast forward to what we're facing today? And now you've got the riots, and you've got Black Lives Matter, and you've got all these different things going on. When is that actually a standing up in a good way, and when is it totally rebellious and destructive? And so just figuring out the difference between, how about this, good rebellion and bad rebellion? Don't exactly want to go there, but that might at least get your attention.
Well, because some rebellion, like you said, with the founding of the country, there was obvious good outcomes from that rebellion. Might not have been perfect, but it has gotten significantly better as the time has gone on. But then there's some rebellion that seems really counterproductive.
Let's just change the word, because if you're going to use the word rebellion, I think you end up having a problem.
Okay.
So what do? We talk about here, I talk a lot about moving from weaknesses to strength, moving from even sin areas to godly areas. And so we've talked previous time, we laid some of the foundation for this, for how that movement happens and how we move from one to the other. Well, this again is from Releasing God's Life. It's a book that I wrote several years ago, and it talks about rebellion. What's the core value of rebellion? Why did God create people who have tendencies to slide off into rebellion? God didn't create rebellion, but there are people who take who God created them to be, and then the next thing you know, that thing slides off into the place of rebellion, which is something that is against God, against people, etc.
So the rebel without a cause actually has a purpose that's a godly purpose. They've just chosen to go off in
another
ways.
direction.
Okay.
The core value that God has created is initiative, creativity, and strength. So think about the rebels that you know. The rebels that you know are people who, they're strength people. I love that word. We need strength people. We need people with resolve, with some fire, with some passion. So when you take that strength person, they don't like to be told no, or they don't like to be weak, or they don't like to be pressed down or oppressed. They're the ones who are going to stand up against oppression. They're the ones who are going to fight being controlled. Now, if you fast forward back to God, you got a problem. God kind of wants to be Lord.
Right.
He kind of wants to be in charge. So if I'm rebelling against God, it becomes pretty easy. If I'm rebelling against God, I'm rebelling against my Creator. We know that's not a good thing. But what if I'm using my strength value to stand up for something that really is a God value? There's somebody being oppressed. There's somebody being abused. I see that. I come in with my strength value to rescue that particular person. It becomes a lot of times murky, gray. It's like, okay, when is that justified? When is that not justified? All of those questions end up being really difficult sometimes to sort out.
I think that's a lot of what we're dealing with as a country right now, because on its face, the cause of what is maybe behind some of these riots is a just cause. We do want to make sure that people are not oppressed for skin color or for beliefs or for any of that. And even as a staunch believer that the Bible is correct and that Jesus is the only way, I still don't want that forced on someone else because God doesn't force it on us. So it should be a free choosing of that. What do you think is a way, rather than burning things down and then meeting it with huge amounts of police, force, what's a way that maybe we can utilize God's response in a human level? What can we do differently?
One of the problems that you have, and I've talked about this already, but the Proverbs 30 generation, that there's a kind of an arrogance, and they're really, they're almost like a spoiled child. If you take a strength person and you spoil a strength person, they really start to throw temper tantrums throughout their life. And frankly, when someone's in that temper tantrum zone, first of all, you can't do much with them. One of the one-liners that I use a lot is heart change comes through heart choice. So if I'm actually going to work with you, if I'm actually going to get somewhere with you, somewhere in there's got to be some cooperation. There's got to be connection. There's got to be trust. There's got to be listening. There's got to be cooperation. If that's not happening, then it does get into a power struggle. Well, what happens with a rebel person? If you're a power person, it's about I win, you lose. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And frankly, that's a lot of what's happening in our culture today. You have it tends to be more white, law and order, et cetera. I mean, that's the way it's depicted. I don't believe that's the way it is, because you go into communities, you've got black police chiefs, you've got a significant black presence in the force, and yet that police force is being seen as oppressive and racially insensitive and institutional racism. Maybe. Is it possible that's still going on? Yes. But what you have a power struggle. And people who are strength people, it becomes all about winning instead of about us winning. There's a huge difference there. When we as a culture start looking towards outcomes, and we actually start thinking about how can the culture win? How can the nation win? How can we all come together in a cooperative way? That's a better picture for strength people, because otherwise it's I win, you lose. And which of us does not respond negatively to that kind of a picture?
So when the strength person is at an elevated level and they're already into that I have to win at all costs mode, how can we de-escalate that and show we're trying to get the same goals, whether it's different means, but when there's already that heightened level, how do we break through that wall?
My answer is sometimes you can't. Sometimes it actually has to be met with a strength type of response, and people don't like to go there, but I would go back to World War II and Adolf Hitler. Mm-hmm. There's a level at which I'm not sure anything could have changed that except force. We don't know. We know what did happen. We know how it played out. But there are times when someone's in a zone like that you almost have to be stopped first, because heart change also comes out of humility. Heart change also comes out of brokenness. I work with addicts a lot. Many times they've got to hit that wall. Many times they've got to hit that really difficult place before there's any level of listening, any level of cooperation. And so until that happens, sometimes you've got nothing to start with. And so there are times when it does end up being I win, you lose. That's the difference between chaos or anarchy and at least some form of civilization. Most of the time, people will choose at least some form of civilization, right, even if there's a caste system, even if there's corruption, even if there's ugliness going on. Most of the time, people will choose some kind of civilization, some kind of rule of law, some kind of structure over nothing, because chaos and anarchy, it's the strongest one wins, and life becomes incredibly ugly to live. Somewhere in there, we've got to start choosing outcomes. We've got to start choosing that wow, I've got to take these steps because it's going to be a better life. We're in a zone right now with the riots that there's a kind of a burn it down mentality. And some of the key people who are in that burn it down zone are not the blacks, they're whites. They're whites who are in there adopting a cause, grabbing a hold of this thing, and trying to say, you know what, we're just going to have to destroy everything that's out there and maybe we'll start over. There's a problem with that. You may be talking 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. How many years will it take us to recover from the level of destruction that we're seeing? And there certainly is a better way. And ultimately, that comes back to we've got to start hearing one another, creating platforms of trust, connection, etc. Are there going to be times in there where you got to kind of shut down the destruction and you've got to press back? Absolutely. Absolutely. But if you approach that with the mentality of, I'm going to come in and crush you, and there is a maximum force applied to utterly crush people, chances are all you're going to do is just create a smoldering hostility that's only going to rise back up one more time.
So everything that you've said is making sense, to my natural mind. Is there any biblical support for what you're suggesting as a response to somebody that's in that strength position or that position of rebellion?
Proverbs 29, I believe it is. It talks about when a man is corrected many times and he stiffens his neck, he shall be crushed, he shall be broken, and that without remedy. It's interesting when we're talking about these spiritual flows, when we're talking about these core values, God has a response to core values, and because people are made in the image of God, people tend to have that response. If somebody comes to you and tries to intimidate you, tries to control you, tries to just break you down, what happens? We tend to fight back. There tends to be that war going back and forth. And as I said with addicts, a lot of times they have to hit that wall. They have to hit that breaking point before there's a humility where they can go forward. So what happens when God's dealing with a rebel, many times it has to come to that point of crushing. And so what you see in scriptures, God will warn, he'll warn again, he'll warn again, but somewhere along the line, he can't just gently push back. He can't just gently hold. There's got to be a hard enough blow to get the attention of the rebel, because the rebel only understands strength. So somewhere in there's got to be that pushback. There's got to be that hard thing. Another piece that comes out of that, just to wrap your brain around, another piece that comes out of that is the idea of, if I am counseling with someone and they've gone from tragedy to tragedy to tragedy, chances are it's like, okay, you've been crushed, and crushed. I wonder if there isn't some of that rebel. I am not going to be told what to do. I'm on a path. A lot of times that's going on in them, and I'm saying you might want to look at the spiritual stuff going on inside of you.
Because once they're in that flow of my way is the only way, or I'm not going to be told what to do, even good advice is thrown out the window because it's automatically interpreted as I'm being controlled.
I know better than you. I'm telling you what to do.
So going back to our current events and situations that we're seeing across the country, what would you see as the remedy or the biblical response to try to lower the tension in the country right now?
Well, first of all, there's not a remedy. You really have, on the two sides, you have really strongly entrenched feelings, and there's going to be some level of battle that goes on. And frankly, as much as I hate to say it, almost ends up having to be a win-lose type of a thing somewhere along the line, somehow, some way. My opinion is we've got to come into that in a way to restore some level of order. Now, if the manner in which you restore that order is a kind of a crushing that creates more hostility, wow, that gets really difficult. So the manner in which you approach it, if at all possible, everything you do, there needs to be dialogue. There needs to be some level of working together and coming together in this piece where we actually start seeing the values that are in play and we're able to talk about that. If one side wins, frankly, and wins in a devastating, overwhelming manner, I think in the end, it's just another battle that's going to come back. So we really work at it. Doesn't matter which side you're on. You work at seeing these core values sort of things. You begin to understand, all right, this is what's going on in the minds of this person. This is where the heart of that person is. How can we kind of meet halfway where we can get an understanding and talk about this? That's where, if I go back to where Martin Luther King was, he brought a faith component to this thing, and so it wasn't a win at all costs. It wasn't a destroy the other people. It was, we have to approach this with integrity. If we don't approach this with integrity, it's all going to be lost. And that's what we have going today. And that's what scares me about Black Lives Matter or the riots or whatever you want to talk about right now. You're seeing minimal to no faith side to it. And because of that, there is much more of a might makes right. And frankly, it's not just Black Lives Matter. In the response to that, you've got a whole arm of people who are, you know what, we're going to crush you. Okay, we don't have anything to work with. But when you introduce a faith element, what did Christ do? Christ laid down his life for others. And we're also seeing that. We're seeing revival movements around the nation break out that are just really neat. And generally, I hate to say this, but generally it has to almost be a black pastor at that point who steps up and takes that initiative and starts drawing people back together in that name. And you're seeing blacks and whites and all kinds of different people come together, listening to one another. And at an individual level, you've got one person beginning to connect with another person. Ultimately, that's where it's going to have to happen. I believe the victory is going to have to start almost grassroots, ground up, people of faith who are doing the Christ-like thing and connecting with other people. I think if we come out of this in any kind of positive way, it's going to be ground up and not top down.
Do you think we're already too far gone? We've kind of alluded to the point that right now there's no dialogue. Even when you go further away from riots and just into politics in general, everything is, that's your side, this is my side. We have absolutely nothing that we can even discuss. Have we reached that point? Or is there still some hope that we can actually meet more in the middle?
When you're talking top down, I would almost say it's too late. We're done. When you hear the rhetoric, when you hear all of the stuff, I don't know how we can have hope. It really is, you look at congressional leaders or you look at the president or you look at whoever, there's just no respect. You know, and if there is no respect, how can we have hope for the future? So those things are totally against us. But God is greater than all of that. And the hope of this nation, I believe, lies in the responses of the people and more people that are doing what I talked about, where you get a revival movement and you get people coming together in unity and you start connecting. Hopefully out of that, you will get a new leadership thrust that will change some of the kinds of things that are entrenched and some of the stuff that we're seeing, hearing, that it's like when you look at it, it really is hard to place your hope in much of anything that's happening.
And it's really interesting how we got to this point, because for the most part, person to person, everyone understands that. We all know that you have to have some level of respect for the person that you're sitting with or working with or operating with on a daily basis. Yet when it becomes a group thing, all of those common sense details just seem to fly right out the window. You and I disagree frequently on things, yet we've never gotten to a level where it's, nope, I can't talk to you and you can't talk to me, because we both recognize that while we might disagree, we're working toward the same thing. Why do you think that has been lost in the last decade in the American way of life?
God. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify, but we have removed faith out of the public sphere, and we've removed any sense of judgment. We've removed any sense of something greater. When you remove that, it does come back to might makes right, and there's no God intervening. There's no hope in anything like that. Now it does become a power struggle, and I have to win. I mean, that just takes it into a completely different place. If I'm a person of faith, and I am, that's why I'm able to still bring hope. I'm able to say, you know what? If we pray, if we seek God, God is still great enough to intervene. And so then if out of that I'm responding with integrity, I'm responding with love, I'm listening, I'm not responding to your taunts, I'm not responding to your insults according to what you're doing to me. If I'm able to live the life of Christ and absorb that and actually give you respect back and give you some listening back, now there's hope for the nation. But one of the things that I fear, we really have, we've made Christians and churches, non-essentials, and we're going to shut you down, and Christianity is being pushed more and more to the side to where it's not even welcome. So we have to bring faith back into the public sphere to a greater degree, and we've got to reverse that trend. If we don't reverse that trend, it really does become a war to see who is the strongest, and nobody will win in that war.
And that religion component is pretty huge, and it's never more clear than when something like the Supreme Court justice comes up for nomination. And without going into the politics of it, just the religion, we're already hearing people questioning, well, can someone that holds a biblical view or a religious view actually be trusted to enforce laws or make right things? And I think that's part of the reason, and I agree with you, of why we are where we are. We have no moral compass anymore, and it seems to be it's just whatever works for you, and then everybody clashes and we wonder why. Do you have any parting words or any advice for the listener that wants to just make a difference in the small sphere of influence that they have? What can they do to affect things for better? Could you just address our listeners now?
Well, again, coming out of the revival movement, it's interesting. Some of you may not know this, but there was a revival movement started literally right there where the George Floyd incident started. And I have a friend who's actually been there, who's visited that and listened to Pastor Charles do the preaching. And one of the things that he did there, he said, okay, I want you to find someone that's different than you. And I want you to talk to them, and I want you to spend some time with them. And that seems like a small thing. But one of the things, I teach on spiritual gifts, and I call it stand up, sit down. There are gifts that are just very different from each other, and that's part of why we end up with denominations. You get this value emphasized, you get this value emphasized, and both of those values technically are in Christ. They're a part of God. They're a part of what God has created. But the mercy gift and the more prophetic truth gift, they don't look alike, don't feel alike, and don't necessarily get along all the time. But guess what? Both are created by God. And when you begin to understand that both are created by God, I start to understand that different doesn't mean bad, doesn't mean wrong, doesn't mean evil. In fact, in the big picture of things, both of them have their time, they have their place, and I call it stand up, sit down. There's a time when that more forceful use of strength is absolutely necessary, and if we don't get it, we can't get better. There's times when that force and strength needs to sit down, and the mercy and the compassion, the understanding needs to stand up. And we've lost these kinds of things. It becomes one or the other, and so we're not healthy. But one of the things that really scares me is what's happening to the church right now across the nation. More and more of these voices are trying to eliminate the church's voice, and that's where the church needs to stand up. The church needs to exercise strength of, you know what, if I go to jail, I go to jail. If I, whatever, I have to do what God says. We saw that in the book of Acts, where the apostles were being threatened, and they said, You know what? Whether it's right in your sight, we don't know, but God has clearly told us we have to do that. One of the things we are going to, I believe, have to see is the church having a strength response.
In the current climate of churches in the U.S., it's hard to imagine the church as we've come to know it in my generation and the generations since a strength response. What would that look like to you?
Let me give a bit of a historical perspective. Really, for at least the last 400 years, it's been grace and mercy, grace and mercy, grace and mercy have just been preached and preached and preached in the churches. So when you have that, what happens? That makes an imprint on what's going on. And what's kind of interesting, it's been preached to such an extent that a lot of times men aren't even comfortable in church. They walk in, they look around, they go, this doesn't fit me, it doesn't fit who I am, especially if it's quote unquote a man's man. And they're like, okay, I'm done with church. And so it's been preached to such an extent that you almost feel like church is for women a lot of times. Well, not so. It's just the grace and mercy value has been preached to this crazy level. There is also the prophetic value. There's also leadership gifts. There's et cetera, which is much more of a strength response and a stand-up response. So when the church actually begins to bring this back in, and conflicts like this, and the church being persecuted or crushed or told that they have no voice, when the church begins to wake up and go, wait a minute, this one isn't going to work with just love and mercy, there's got to be a kind of a strength response, and the strength response may be, no, I'm going to go ahead and go to this park and worship. And we're seeing that. We're seeing places where they'll allow riots, they'll allow everything else under the sun. In Chicago, it was interesting. They were basically trying to shut down a church thing, and after it was over, they're downtown and they've got a huge Mexican celebration going on right out there in the open. That was okay. The church was not okay. At some point, we have to be able to know when it's time for a strength response and stand up. If we don't stand up, it's not good. Now, let me just say mass for a little bit. There are times when we choose the wrong hill to die on. And me personally, I mean, some people say, oh, masks are the hill, et cetera. All right, you figure it out on your own. But my point is, I want to choose the right hills to die on, the right times to stand up in strength response, because I don't get that many choices of when it's time for a strength response. So when I stand, it's when I need to be standing. And when I stand, it's going to be, you're not allowed to preach the gospel. You're not allowed to speak what God wants you to speak. That's when it's time for the church to say, no, I have to go there. I have to do this.
And it's troubling times because we are seeing that on a relatively frequent basis with the churches being targeted for that. Thank you for your thoughts on this extremely complex issue. I don't think we're under any false pretenses that this is going to get solved in a 30-minute podcast, but I do think it is good to have a voice of calm and clarity there that's showing we do have more in common than we think, and there are biblical ways that we can get together to work this out. We want to thank you for taking the time to join us today here on Effective Heart Change. I'm Matthew, and this has been David. We look forward to seeing you in the next one.
Video production, editing, and audio by Matthew. Set design and setup by Ashley. Content recorded live at Studio 104.